plenty of time for socializing. It is built into the schedule. I promise you that. It's an MSU conference. Obviously, there's going to be some party time. This iteration of Moral Media has been generously funded both by contributions from the Michigan State University Department of Communication, so thank you, Mo Turner and the department, and also by a grant that 4 of us in the room achieved from the Templeton Religion Trust for our project Character Engagement and Moral Understanding in Screen Stories. So I want to call out, just acknowledge the other PIs on the grant. So Carl Pentinga, who's right there. Carl is not looking at me or drawing attention, but he is. He's still finishing his introduction for Maurice. And Dan Levitt is not with us yet, but he will join us later. We have an incredible lineup of talks and speakers, starting with Murray Smith tonight, who's going to talk about one of the key elements in our grant project, which is character engagement. And then we also have Art Rainey and James Harold, who will do keynotes tomorrow, as well as over 20 presentations and posters. Talks will be recorded as long as the presenters agree, and we will host them on the YouTube channel of the Department of Communication. So this is the first time we've ever had an interdisciplinary iteration of the conference. So we're super excited for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. Generally, this tends to be a very communication science sort of oriented and heavy conference. So we're really, really excited that this year we've broadened it to include lots of other inputs from other disciplines, but we're all looking at the same questions about how the morality and media relate. Please do, if you had not planned to, although I think everybody here has planned to, join us for drinks tonight at the Red Cedar Spirits Distillery. We will have Saddleback Barbecue catering. And if those of you are interested, at 5:30 there is a distillery tour, although if we don't make it there by 5:30, that's fine. We're officially there at 6. I will help coordinate rides to that after Murray's talk. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Carl, who has written a brilliant, I mean, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but.
Thanks for the setup. I'm going to do badly now.
He's written a mediocre introduction. Speaker Murray Smith.
Yeah, that's more like it.
There you go.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm Carl Plantinga. I'm a research fellow at Calvin University, just a little ways away from here down the road. I first want to thank Allison and Sarah for organizing this conference. Very appreciative. It's a lot of work, I know that, because I've organized a few conferences myself. So thank you very much. And of course, we also need to acknowledge the Templeton Religion Trust through a grant that we have, the 4 of us, which Allison just mentioned to you. The grant is called Character Engagement and Moral Understanding in Screen Stories. And we're interested in discussing whether and under what conditions narrative fiction can lead to moral understanding in viewers. And the nature of moral understanding is one of the first hurdles that we have been dealing with. And for now, it's best just to think of it as a process, not a steady state. Something that maybe the media can aim us toward or help us make another step toward. So it's not an easily defined concept, but it has components that are more specific and that I think are more capable of being tested empirically and being understood in a more specific way. So that's the way that at least I am thinking of moral understanding. And our particular interest is in the role that character engagement plays in this process. For that reason, Murray Smith, this man standing over here to my right, is the right person to kick off the conference. Murray and I were both PhD students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison many, many moons ago. And we're in the film studies program, so we're both in the discipline of film studies. But we have, and it's typically considered to be a humanistic discipline. We don't do a lot of empirical work in film and media studies. But Murray and I are part of a movement within the discipline called cognitive film theory. And cognitive film theorists have a very strong interest in the sciences and in empirical work generally. So our group is already interdisciplinary, but we're hoping that with this conference, we can really kickstart a more intense interdisciplinary collaboration in exploring these sorts of issues. So Anyway, Murray Smith is a professor of film and media studies at the University of Kent, and he is the right person to talk about the relationship of character engagement and moral understanding because he's one of the go-to people in our field. He wrote a book called Character Engagement, and there are flyers for this book in the back.
I will now display the book.
Yeah. Yeah. And we both believe that to empirically or in any other way, theoretically, think about the role of character engagement in generating moral understanding, we need to have both theoretical sophistication and empirical verification. So I think we agree on that. So I think that's what Murray is going to talk about today. So without further ado, yeah.
Okay, let's switch the light off so everyone can now fall asleep. Late afternoon rest. Just one little aside before I say the normal things that one begins with. When Carl said that he and I are members of the discipline of film studies, it just ran through my head that really we're members of the indiscipline of film studies. I think that's the more appropriate way to think of that field of study. Anyway, coming back to the conventional stuff, I just want to thank my project partners, so Alison, Carl, Dan, Sarah. It's wonderful to be working with these people on this project. And thank you, Alison and Sarah, for your work in arranging this particular event. I'm really delighted and honored to be kicking it off. This is good. Okay, so here's my version of the "it's a work in progress" comment. What I'm going to do today is kind of basically introduce the framework of the book that Carl mentioned. Why don't I just get the next slide up? The microphone is working fine, right? Yes? Okay, good. First edition was way back in 1995. Second edition, I finally got around to it this year, or it came out this year. So what I'm going to do is essentially kind of sketch what this book is and what motivated the book. And then in the sort of second part of the talk, try and begin to kind of think about how it might relate to the kind of disciplinary framework which most of you are coming from, which is more empirically oriented, right? So assuming that working on the basis of which is normally a media psychology event. And the other thing to mention at the outset is so this is a spoiler alert, and I don't care. I'm gonna use as a kind of running example through the talk, yes, very predictable, Better Call Saul, which is of course just completed, at least for those of you who are on top of things. So yeah, no apologies for those of you who are watching it but haven't yet got to the conclusion. You can, I guess, block your ears if you really need to. But it just seemed like an irresistible kind of case to make reference to try and explain some of the concepts. So, engaging characters, fiction, emotion, and the cinema. What is it? Well, it's basically a theoretical model of our emotional responses to fictional characters. So the reason I put a couple of words in brackets there is it's not just a model of our emotional responses, it's generally a model of, as it were, all the kinds of cognition which are prompted when we engage with narrative works, especially fictional works. Many of those, of course, are emotional. And when we're thinking about moral responses, at least I think most of us would probably intuitively agree that they're going to be heavily morally saturated, if not exclusively emotional. So emotional responses they loom large, even if the model is broader than merely emotional responses. Fictional, again, I put it in brackets to just signal the fact that the model also has the ambition really to talk about how characterization works across all forms of narrative. So, can't plant it. Can't take this guy anyway. Yeah, so there is a sense in which, I'm not going to defend this point, there is a sense in which you can think of the represented agents in non-fictions as characters. I mean, they're not characters in every sense, right? So the prototypical target for the theory is fictional characterization, but I would defend the idea, I do defend the idea that it has application to non-fictional narratives as well. And what motivated me to develop this model, as I say, back in the 90s originally, was essentially the thought that the predominant concept and way of thinking about how we respond to characters in fictions and narratives more generally works around the concept of identification, both in its sort of folk variant, right, but also in its kind of high theoretical variants. And of course, I'm thinking mostly there psychoanalysis, right? But you know, to my mind, and of course I'm not unique in this, you know, there are just numerous problems with both the folk variant and the theoretical variant. So this was an attempt to some extent, wipe the slate clean and say, okay, let's set the concept of identification aside and try and develop a set of concepts in a theoretical framework to analyze how it is we respond to characters in a more fine-grained and precise way than identification talk generally allows us to, right? So you can think of it as an attempt to kind of not deny that there is a phenomenon of identification, but to replace it, right? To replace it through a kind of set of refinements. Okay, so here's a kind of plan of action for the rest of the talk. So I've essentially already done the first item there. What I'm going to be getting to eventually is thinking about the question, you know, bearing in mind the Templeton project, which has been mentioned already. There are really kind of two ways in which morality kind of like connects with a phenomenon of character engagement. So on the one hand, we've got the first question. We can think about how is it that morality shapes our responses to characters. Right? So when we're responding to fictional characters or the non-fictional agents, how do kind of moral considerations work into those responses we have? On the other hand, the second question, there's a kind of, you know, the other side of the equation, so to speak. How then does character engagement potentially shape moral understanding? Right? So I'm thinking with the first question, I'm thinking of morality as a kind of input to how characterization works and how we respond to characters. The second question turns our attention to how the process of responding to characters in narrative produces outputs with respect to moral understanding. And of course, that might mean moral misunderstanding. Wherever there's the possibility of the kind of positive variant, there's always the kind of possibility of the danger of misunderstanding as well. And the other thing that I'm going to turn my attention to in the kind of later part of the talk then is how we might think about how some of the claims of this model could be operationalized, right? In the sense of made tractable for empirical investigation. And that's a kind of pertinent question because certainly that was no part of, that was no part of the thinking of the design of the theory. Although the theory is kind of very attentive to the relevant empirical research which needs to be accommodated in the formulation of the theory. It wasn't part of the discipline, the indiscipline of film studies, that the theory should be kind of like designed so it's immediately obvious how it could be subjected to empirical testing. And I think that's fine, actually. I'm going to kind of defend that point about the nature of what a theory is, or at least a theory like this is, but that doesn't preclude the thought that we could move towards testing some of its implications. So I'll get to that further on in the talk. All right. So here is a possibly somewhat intimidating. So this is the diagram of the book, which kind of summarizes the whole model. So what I'm going to do is just use this diagram to kind of give you a quick whistle-stop tour of the central concepts in the book, and then we can kind of like see how they apply to certain examples and get on to those later questions about the implications of all of this for moral understanding and for operationalizing some of the claims of the book. So, first thing to notice is these three concepts here. So this is recognition, alignment, and allegiance. So these are the three most central concepts in the theory, which, if we're thinking about in simplest terms, these replace the notion of identification, right? So the argument is that there are three basic ways in which we respond to characters in narratives. We recognize, and I'm going to explain each of these, okay? We recognize them, we're aligned with them in certain ways, and we are allied, or we form allegiances with them. And each of these can turn out in a myriad of different particular ways. Right? Now, those three concepts all break down in certain ways, which I'll come to in a second. And they're all captured underneath, or kind of, how can I put this? They're all conceptualized within the space of sympathy, which I understand in a certain way, but I also accommodate the notion of empathy as a distinct kind of psychological process. And the argument is, the reason this is a separate box over here is that empathy kind of feeds in to these sympathetic responses. Let me bring up the next slide and say something to explain those points. So some people, including my friend and colleague Carl, think that it's difficult to maintain a sharp distinction between sympathy and empathy, at least in practice. Right? That in any given actual response to a narrative, these kinds of responses are hard to pull apart from one another. And I think that's probably true in experience, but I think there is a significant and clear distinction to be made between the two. So we can think of sympathy as feeling for a person or a represented agent character, whereas empathy is feeling with, like replicating the states of a person or a character. Right? So that's what the distinction between sympathy and empathy speaks to. And the broad thrust of the model, just to flip back to the diagram a second, the idea is that empathy does play a role, right? So there are ways in which narratives in all media do solicit and prompt empathic responses, but they do so ultimately, they sort of feed into a more general kind of response, which is more aptly characterized in sympathy. In other words, it's a mistake to think about our responses to fictions primarily on the model of an empathic response, as if we're kind of locked in, right, predominantly to the mindset of just this character, just that character. The thought is more that we're sort of dipping into, we're invited into the minds of individual characters, but we're generally always being pulled out into a larger context, right, where we see how various characters in the fictional world as a whole relate to one another. Okay. So, okay, let's now get a bit more colorful, get a bit more detail, get some examples on the table. So first of all, I said there were three very central concepts which you can think of as replacing the concept of identification as it's casually used. So the first of these concepts is recognition. And the thought here is, the first thing we need to do when we engage with a narrative, right, is we have to recognize that there is an agent, or there's a set of agents. We have to be able to pick them out as distinct from other agents in the fictional world. And this breaks down into two sub-concepts or processes: individuation and re-identification. So individuation is the idea that for there to be a character distinct from another character, that character has to have features which individuate it, right? from all the other characters within that fictional world. If you think about, say, an animated cartoon, which work with stick figures, right? You can kind of imagine a kind of a fictional world of that sort, where there is no individuation between these stick figures, right? Of course, that's not generally how most live-action films work. These two examples over here are kind of meant to dramatize kind of like how this can get kind of like quite subtle and interesting. So we've got the Salamanca twin cousins, I think they are. Yeah, you know, the point being that they are, because they're supposed to be twins, they're obviously very similar in their physical features and sometimes hard to kind of discriminate from one another. But we always are able to discriminate between them because they're slightly different in their physical features and they're usually wearing slightly different clothing, so we can kind of pull them apart. Then down here at the bottom right, we've got the film Moon. Sorry about the crummy slide. If you've seen this, you'll kind of know it's a very interesting film which kind of like explores cloning, right? And so you've got the same actor, Sam Rockwell, playing what emerges to be a kind of variety of versions of what initially appear to be the same figure, but they're not. And so, you know, as the film develops, there are ways in which we're clearly allowed to individuate them, even though they're being embodied by the same performer. Re-identification really builds on the idea of identification, but adding the idea that when we engage with a narrative, we not only need to be able to individuate characters at a given moment. So Salamanca twin A is distinct from Salamanca twin B, right? But we also need to track them over time. So that's what re-identification refers to, right? We need to be able to figure out, is this character I'm seeing now the same character as I saw 20 minutes ago, or a distinct character? And this gets interesting, right? When the physical characteristics of characters change in some way. So if we're thinking of Better Call Saul again, think about the way Jimmy takes on a disguise. He also, of course, ages in complex and tricky ways, right, for the makers of the show, because Better Call Saul takes place in the past, but the actor is older than he was when they were making Breaking Bad. So we've got change through aging, but we've also got things like injury. So the character Hector Salamanca, of course, gets brain injured, right, by the drug that's introduced, or I forget quite how it works. Is he gets too much of his heart pills or too few of them. But we know what happens to him. Yeah? He ends up wordless in a wheelchair. So his physical characteristics change. They're relatively mild examples, right? But you can probably all think of cases where re-identification is put under a lot of pressure because the kind of changes that a character undergoes are much more dramatic than the examples I've given. All right, I'm going to kind of skip certain sub-points like this one, for example, which we can come back to if people want to. I know that, as usual, I've got way too much material, and if we want to get to that 5:30, I'm going to step on the gas, right? So, okay. All right, second of the three big concepts, right? So we had recognition, now we come to alignment. So alignment, putting it in formulaic terms, refers to the idea of how much information we share with the character. And this, in turn, again, breaks down into what I call spatial attachment and subjective access. So why that distinction? Well, something that narratives often do, very commonly do, is they'll attach us to a character, which is to say, we're sort of following them through the space of the story. Right? But that doesn't automatically translate into having transparent access to what they're thinking and feeling. So a very common thing, right, in narratives of all sorts is being in the presence of a character, but having somewhat less than full understanding of what they're up to and what they're thinking and feeling. Okay? And is this where I was going to show a clip? I think it probably was, yeah, one of the clips. So, to take the, I'm going to show you a clip to support this point in a second. So, in Better Call Saul, we're frequently in the company of characters who are kind of, engaged in some, intrigue, and we're not quite clear what they're up to. So it's very often the case with Jimmy and Kim when they're pursuing their pranks, and it's often the case with this character, Lalo Salamanca. So, can I show a clip?
I think so. Did
Yeah,
you
yeah. We're fine. So that was a rhetorical.
Oh, then yes, sure. I
So-
support with whatever you want, Mark.
All right, whatever. Okay, here we go. Okay. So, I mean, for those of you who don't know the show at all, or those of you who aren't at this point in the show, so this is,
What, this one, is it funny? Is it fun?
yeah, it's fun. It's just a dance. It's going to get clearer. So this is season 6, episode 7, which I think was the kind of climactic episode of the first half of the final season. Okay. So what we're going to see, you don't really need to kind of know a lot about the context of the action here. I think it will work in a self-contained way. So let me just show it, and I'll say a few words. So this features Lalo Salamanca, okay, the character I just mentioned. Again, for the sake of time, I've been coming off slightly shorter than I wanted to. It's a wonderfully self-contained sequence, which kind of ends with the camera kind of like showing us what he sees, which is, if you know the show, the laundromat. But again, for time, I'll leave it. I've got it to you there. So the point I am going to come back and use this sequence in a different way. But the immediate point to note about it is just as an example of what I was meaning about spatial attachment without anything like full subjective access, right? So we know this guy is up to no good, right? But it's quite unclear exactly what he's doing down in the sewer, right? At this point, right? Of course, we gradually get to understand what he is up to, but not through anything like a voiceover, right? Or anything as clear and as transparent as that. And that, of course, is a choice for filmmakers. Right? So a lot of filmmakers will use devices like voiceover if they wish to give us subjective access, transparent subjective access to a character at a given moment. Okay. So. All right. So we've covered recognition, we've covered alignment, or at least in the basics. That becomes the third of the 3 replacement concepts, right? Concepts which are collectively kind of offering an alternative to the commonplace notion of identification. That one is allegiance, which speaks to the idea of not whether we have this much or that much information we share with a character or are given with a character, but the degree to which we are drawn into a sympathetic relationship with the character, okay, or not. Again, I'm going to kind of, well, maybe I won't entirely skip these. Essentially, that breaks down into thought that at least these two kind of axes of variation are possible. So there are different kinds of moral structure. Some are very stark, dividing characters into very good characters and very bad characters. That's what they call a Manichaean structure. Much more common in the contemporary era are graduated structures, right? Which kind of like populate the fictional world with characters of all sorts of moral character. Right? Some good, some bad, many of mixed moral character in the foreground of the action. I certainly think that is true of Better Call Saul. In particular, this is, I won't develop this point, but an interesting, and this speaks to the idea of moral orientation. So moral orientation is about how moral structure develops over time. Is it stable or dynamic, right? So in respect of that idea, two characters to think about in this show are Kim and Nacho, right? Who I think there's an interesting kind of mirror image between those two characters, where Kim sort of breaks bad, she breaks bad for a while, and Nacho kind of gradually emerges as a kind of morally better character than you take him to be in the early seasons. Okay. All right, so much for the sketch of the model. And it is just a sketch, right? So there's a lot more that I do say in the book. But I'm sort of blasting through this to get to the kind of points of particular interest for us. So one question which we need to think about here is, what are the factors which shape our allegiance, right? So the third of those processes, I call basic processes, the one which bears upon how and to what degree we develop sympathetic responses, or on the other hand, antipathetic responses towards characters. What are the factors which bear on that? Now, another kind of central area of argument that I've had with various people over the years, again, including Carl, is how important are our moral reactions relative to other reactions? So my position on this is they're absolutely central. The single most important thing which determines our sympathies toward characters are the moral judgments that we make about characters. In other words, do we find them kind, courageous, generous, all the other specific moral judgments which are out there. The alternative view is to suggest that instead of those moral responses playing such a central role, it's other things like other non-moral factors like attractiveness, charm, wit, those other forms of non-moral appeal play a bigger role than I allow. And it is an interesting debate, but that's where I stand on it. So in summary, I say that those non-moral factors can inflect or modify, but they can't form the foundation of the sympathetic responses we have to characters, or they don't. It's kind of like it's a descriptive claim, first of all. It's the fact about how human psychology works. Here's another important point to make in this context, right? So when I talk about, it might have been a bit misleading a second ago when I was talking about moral judgments, right? What I'm really talking about, first of all, is that when we respond to narratives, the first thing we're having is we're having immediate moral reactions, okay? Automatic, quick and dirty reactions, right? To the way the character is behaving. And then some narratives will solicit another kind, a sort of second order kind of moral response, which I'm going to call moral deliberation. Right? So I'm appealing here to these so-called dual process theories of cognition in general. Everyone is doubts familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work, but in the domain of moral psychology, Joshua Green's book, Moral Tribes, would be one of the significant works here, where the idea is is that our moral cognition kind of falls into two types, right? That we have these kind of fast, instinctive reactions, right? But then we also have the capability to kind of deliberate in a more extended fashion, more carefully, right? And both are crucial features of moral cognition for humans in general. So I'm basically saying that both are relevant. And you shouldn't think that when I kind of like, I'm not suggesting that kind of the way when I talk about the centrality of moral responses to characters in terms of how our sympathies develop towards characters, that's not saying that these are always, or even in general, carefully considered moral judgments which are the result of careful moral deliberation. On the contrary, I'm saying most of the time it's quick and dirty judgments which the filmmakers are inviting us to have. And it's only a sort of subset of fictions which work on our, give us the kind of space and invite us to kind of then have a sort of second order reflections on those first order moral responses to get into what I'm characterizing as moral deliberation. Okay, where are we on the time?
440.
4:40. Okay, so I'm not doing too bad.
Yeah, you're all
All
right.
right, okay. So I have a little sip of water.
I don't know how far you have to go. So.
That's a very good point. I'm not going to tell you. All right. Now, this is something I've just kind of come across, but I just thought it was an instructive thing to kind of throw into the picture here. Some of you may know this book. I think it's about getting on for a decade old. It's kind of an autobiography of self-described sociopaths. And I thought this passage was kind of interesting in terms of the light it sheds on, so to speak, ordinary non-sociopathic psychology, right? So I'm just going to kind of read you the highlighted sentence in the middle there. She says, sociopaths don't include elements of guilt or moral responsibility in their mental stories, only self-interest and self-preservation. I don't assign moral values to my choices, just cost-benefit. So when I say, right, that moral responses and judgments are central to the way we form sympathies with characters, all I'm saying is this does not describe how we respond to either, or let me back off a second. This doesn't describe how non-sociopathic human agents respond both to other people and to fictional characters, because it leaves out morality. That's what's striking, right, about this characterization of the sociopathic mind. Right? If we take it, I'm not expert enough to know if this is an empirically good description of sociopathy, but I think it was effectively to shed some light on ordinary moral psychology. Okay. Pursuing this question then further of the factors which shape our responses of sympathy or antipathy towards characters. I've said that moral responses are going to be the center of the picture, but we've got to be careful to remember that those moral responses can be both a quick and dirty variety or a more careful, extended, deliberative variety. Now, I guess it's obvious enough that the most obvious thing that we're responding to when we're responding morally to characters is we're thinking about the nature of their actions, what kind of valences their actions have in moral terms, but also their attitudes, right? And I think of an attitude to try and keep it as kind of neat theoretically as possible. I think of an attitude as a kind of virtual action, right? So an attitude tells us what a character, is going to be disposed to do in certain circumstances, even if they haven't yet acted in that fashion. So I think of actions and attitudes as very closely related with one another. But then when we think about how we're given access to the actions and attitudes of characters, then things get interestingly messy and complicated, right? So what I want to draw our attention to now is the way these sorts of things, iconography, physiognomy, and of course what I'm thinking of here is the way in which those outdated, outmoded 19th century and earlier theories of how the look, the physical appearance of human beings tells us something about whether they're good or bad, tells us something about the character. Now, scientifically, we all know that, that's long dead in the water. But artistically, that stuff is still alive and well, right? So storytellers still routinely use cues about appearance and demeanor and posture, right, to move us in this direction or that direction in terms of what we take to be the kind of moral character of the agents we're looking at and our sympathies towards them. So this takes me back to the clip that we saw a few minutes ago. Remember this character, Lalo Salamanca? Now what's striking about Lalo, right, is that he's very charming. He's one of the most sinister characters in the fictional world. He's very good looking, he's very funny, he's playful, right? So he has all of these attributes which are seductive, right? And I'm saying all of that now, that kind of has a bearing on, an indirect bearing on, right, the moral sympathetic judgments that we make of this character. Similarly, music, right, plays a role in how we respond to characters in this kind of moral emotional fashion. So I'm not going to replay the sequence for you, but you might recall when we were watching him walking through the tunnels, right, there was this very sinister music, right, which was accompanying him, right? And that's kind of conveying to us, this guy is up to no good, right? Now the point here is, music is not authentic. There's nothing moral about music on its own terms, right? But it's being used as a device to steer us in this direction or that direction, morally speaking. As iconography and physiognomical features, as a particular kind of iconography, similarly are being used. So when we use this phrase, quick and dirty, right? Kind of like automatic, fast, instinctive moral responses, which aren't the product of extended deliberation. I think the word dirty is worth kind of dwelling on, right? Because what that's suggesting is it's contaminated with stuff which is not strictly, authentically moral reasoning. There's other factors which are, as it were, influencing, inflecting what we might experience as a kind of moral judgment. But really, if we kind of like bear down on it, okay, it is quick and dirty. It's not clean, it's not just moral reasoning that's going on. And often what at least certain fictions will do, the fictions which have the second order feature, right, where they get us to reflect on our first order responses, is they will, over time, get us to look back on those initial reactions and think about, the basis on which they were made and whether it was a good basis on which it was made, a properly moral basis. So I just want to quickly cite here two debates which have a bearing on the kind of issue that I've just been talking through. And I'm sure most of you will be familiar with these debates. So one debate has to do with so-called social or moral intuitionism as an account of morality. This is most famously associated with judgment hate, where the idea is that a good part of our moral makeup is, and he uses the expression moral dumbfounding, right, to express the idea that we have these, what appear to us initially as kind of clear moral reactions, and then when we're asked to rationalize them, his famous example is the one about incest. I won't re-describe it to you for time, but it's like, it just feels wrong, right? That's moral dumbfounding, right? But some of these reactions, at least, are the product of evolution, evolutionary predispositions, And they don't really have a kind of reasoned underpin. Okay, so that's one debate. And the other one here, which is due to our friend Bob Stecker in the audience here at the front, bears on the way in which different kinds of value, especially moral value and aesthetic value, impact on one another in all sorts of domains, but especially in the domain of art and fictional representation. And that's just a quick sketch. I think one difference between these two debates may be that I think what Bob is interested in is, as it were, and this may be a mistake, so forgive me if it is, but so to speak, legitimate ways in which moral and aesthetic values impact on one another. Whereas this debate is focused very much on kind of like our what we take to be our moral reactions really may not be kind of as pure or as clean as we initially understand them to be. Okay. Right. Yeah. So I'm going to show you another clip from Better Call Saul to kind of make good on this claim that I've got, which is just a sort of, it's a hypothesis about a kind of larger, a bigger claim than anything I've said so far, about how we might argue that this series has some kind of positive role to play in relation to moral understanding. But I think in the scope of the time I've got, there's no way I'm going to be able to cash out this claim. So I'll just show you the sequence and maybe say a word or two about the claim in relation to the sequence we're going to look at, and then I'm going to move on in the last few minutes I've got to talk about some of those other issues I promised I'd get to. So let's have a look at this other sequence, which is pretty short. Okay, this is closer. Here we go. So context. Well, unlike the other sequence I showed you, if you don't know the show, you got no chance. Maybe you do. So this character here, Howard, he's been the subject of sustained, really quite malicious pranks on the part of the other two characters we can see in the scene, Ginny and Kim. And what kind of like comes into view in this moment in the drama is the consequences of what we've been invited to take pleasure in as pranking. You see what I'm saying? In other words, it's the moment where, as it were, the moral implications of what, to some extent, the characters and we as the viewer have been invited to think as play, as like largely harmless play. Suddenly it's like, maybe not. Maybe that's not a proper way of understanding what's been going on. And I won't show you the actual way to the end of the scene, but if you've seen the show, you know, it gets darker and darker as the sequence proceeds. Anyway, let's look at a minute of it. And I'll provide that.
I get it. Of course, you both have to play it this way. You're both so very good at it.
It's late, Howard. Do you want to tell us what this is about?
I was wondering that too. What it's all about. I mean, what do you tell yourselves? What justification makes it okay? Howard's such an asshole, he deserves it? Good. So, what is it? I sided with Chuck too often. I took away your office, put you in doc review. All of the above. Howard's daddy helped him get to the top, but you both had a struggle. Howie has so much, we have so little. Let's take him down a peg or two. What allows you to do this to me? Because this isn't just a prank. No. This goes beyond throwing bowling balls on my car. This took planning, coordination. I mean, how many weeks? Or was it months? It couldn't have been easy. So tell me, why? Why go through this elaborate plot just to burn me to the ground?
Burn you to the ground. Howard, come on. You'll be fine. You always land on your feet.
Right, I'm going to pause it there because this shot only lasts for like a second, probably just a second. But it's instructive. So what you begin to understand in the action here is that Kim, oh, what was that? Was that me? Kim, this character, she is beginning to waver psychologically under the heat of Howard's monologue, which is more or less what it is, right? So she is beginning to feel the moral heat. And it's quite subtle because this you could easily miss this reaction on first viewing, right? When you go back, you can see this is what's being tracked, right? She's beginning to feel it. So, let me just come out of the sequence and come back to my slides. So, if I had more time, the kind of hypothesis I'm floating here is that within the scope of the drama itself, we've got this moment where there is a kind of moral wrecking happening, right? Where the central characters are kind of brought up against the moral consequences, right, of their actions. And there's a sort of second layer to this, which is that fictions often, like I can see here that I've made reference to the theory of moral disengagement, which is one associated with one of the other keynote speakers, Art Rainey, will be here tomorrow. Fictions often kind of like play with the idea that it's just a fiction, and we don't need to kind of like fully engage our moral modules, right, of our mind to engage with it properly. So I'm saying this is almost like a reflexive dimension of the series, right? That it's staging the way in which actually, moral matters really are at stake here, even though it's just a fiction, right? And it's invited us to kind of enjoy the pleasures of the pranking and the pure play and so forth, right? It's working on that dialectic between being fully morally engaged and imagining these people as real agents, right, who are going to suffer, some of them, and on the other hand, allowing us to kind of be reminded of the fact that they're merely fictional inventions. Right? It's playing with that dialectic. Okay. Right, quick run through then through a few other points. And then I'll be done. So, as you know from the way in which the project has been introduced, the project is called Character Engagement and Moral Understanding. Right? So far I've really been putting a stress on the first of those two questions, right? Which is to say, how does our moral psychology kind of feed into the way we respond to fictional characters? Now I'm sort of turning to the other side of the equation, which is to say, how might we think about the ways in which engaging with characters has some kind of impact on our moral understanding. And a couple of points here just to kind of float. And I should acknowledge that these largely came out of a conversation with Carl over coffee yesterday, so I've just thrown them in here to see how much, see what legs they've got. But moral understanding, first of all, we might think of as being on a kind of a spectrum from the way in which our kind of immediate responses can be recalibrated, right, by the things that we kind of witness in fiction, right? To the other end of the spectrum where there's much more kind of self-conscious, reflective experience at stake. This is very sketchy, I'm sorry, but but I'm feeling the pressure of time now. One context for this kind of contrast that I'm sketching here is a sort of traditional principle in epistemology, the so-called KK principle, which says, or asks the question, when you know something, do you have to know that you know something? Do you have to kind of understand how it's justified? So the thought here is that's probably too strong a condition to set for the kind of, some of the kinds of moral understanding that we can gain from fictions. Sometimes we can have that very exalted kind of moral understanding where we're not only learning something new in moral terms, but we're understanding the basis on which we've learned something new. Some of the time, it's much simpler than that, right? Our responses are just being retuned, right? So maybe we can kind of like be invited to be more sympathetic to certain kinds of social agent, you know, gay, trans characters that 30 years ago wouldn't have been invited, most fictions wouldn't have invited the same sort of response to, but we're kind of exposed to them in sympathetic ways, and our responses get retuned, right? In a relatively self-conscious way. That's the thought. So that's just a sketch of some of the ways in which moral understanding, perhaps the variety of ways in which it might work. Last couple of slides. So this gets to the question then of how a theory of this type, right, which wasn't formulated with any intention of it being empirically tested in the ways in which I think the majority of you would, as it were, it's the bread and butter of what you do, right? Is to formulate, you know, relatively tight hypotheses which are empirically trackable. Yeah. Now, one thing I want to say here is that the kind of theory that I have in mind, and which I think this book articulates, I'll just say this: I don't think it's empirically testable in its totality. But what I mean by that is because, by definition, a theory is a large set of integrated claims, right? It cannot all at once be subjected to empirical tests. So I think there's something in the nature of a theory which makes it unavailable to empirical testing as a totality, right? It can be evaluated in other ways, right? So a theory can be evaluated in terms of its coherence, its comprehensiveness, its fruitfulness, etc. But I actually think that a theory, at least a theory in the sense that I'm meaning here, again, a large set of integrated claims purporting to explain some domain of existence or some set of phenomena, it's not straightforwardly testable, right? However, the constituent claims within that theory are. So I guess I won't run through all of these claims for the sake of time, but here are some of the claims. Some of these I've maybe at least hinted at today. Some of them are parts of the theory. So just to give you a couple of them. So one claim that I make in the book is that the moral evaluation of acts and of characters begins immediately. The moment we kind of like have recognized the character, that will kick in straight away. Second one, that immediate, quick and dirty moral reactions are followed often by what I call moral deliberation, but only under certain formal and contextual conditions. So I think all of these specific claims which constitute the larger theory, these are empirically tractable, but not when they're all held together as a theory, right? So to conclude, half slide. Here's one particular claim, which I think has been one of the more kind of controversial and interesting claims that the book makes. So remember this distinction between alignment and allegiance. So alignment is information you share or don't share with a character. Allegiance is whether you sympathize with a character and to what degree you sympathize with, right? Now, on one traditional way of thinking, and this is what I call, borrowing another term for psychology, the mere exposure thesis. If you have a narrative structure which aligns you closely and in a sustained way with the character, that is sufficient. Just being constantly exposed to that character as a character will draw your sympathy towards them. So alignment will automatically and reliably generate allegiance. I think that's right. Right? I mean, it's very common that would be the case. But the claim I advance is, so this is at the top now, it's not the mere fact of being aligned with a character that makes us sympathetic to them, so much as what is revealed to us through that alignment. So the reason it's very common for alignment to lead to sympathetic allegiance is that what we discover about a character by being aligned with them allows us to have sympathy for them. We discover things about them which make them more appealing as moral agents, right? But it ain't necessarily so, right? So here's some examples. Here's an actual example. This is the film Cosmopolis, which is structured around this character. I forget his name. And you also forget the actor's name. So Rob Pattinson, right. And he's just a deeply unpleasant character. But we're with him throughout the course of the film. But it doesn't generate anything like a strong kind of sympathy or allegiance with him. Let's imagine a version of Better Call Saul which put Gus Fring not as a kind of secondary character who we kind of see here and there and encounter with other characters, but as the principal. Like, imagine Better Call Saul with Gus Fring in the position of Jimmy Rivera. In other words, he is the central character of the show. Right. Now, I don't think that would make us automatically sympathetic with him unless we found out things about him, right, which changed our judgment of his moral character. Right? Now, so that's one particular hypothesis that the book makes. As I say, it's been somewhat, it does cut against the grain of kind of a lot of preceding theory, which kind of, not in these words, but kind of essentially articulates what I'm calling the mere exposure thesis. And this is what I haven't done the work of suggesting how it can be tested, but when we get to constituent claims of this level of specificity, I imagine that these are perfectly empirically testable, but I, of course, don't possess the skills to do that, which is why I'm collaborating with media psychologists like Alison and Sarah, who are and Dan, who are going to do that work for me, and that is where I will stop talking. And thank you for your time. And yeah, sure, absolutely. Do we have time for?
Yeah, I think we have about 10-ish minutes.
Okay.
15 minutes for questions.
So,
You can.
well, do you want to share? Or?
No, I think you can share. I'm doing all the work testing this theory. If you can call me, I'm happy to share.
Yeah, it might be useful.
Okay.
Yeah. So I know Alberto and then Dan.
Okay, Alberto.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for this such an interesting talk about that important book for everyone researching on character engagement. So I want to come back to Lalo Salamanca that you have mentioned, because he's such a fascinating character, as you have already explained. But I have a point that perhaps you can help me clarify. My sense when I was watching him is that I don't care that much about his actions, his evil actions from a moral point of view. And you haven't shown Lalo's most horrific moment.
Mm-hmm.
But you have explained it, okay? So my sense when watching that moment is that I don't really care what Lalo was doing. My anger was directing towards Kim and Jimmy. So I was thinking why I was having that feeling. And perhaps this is what I would like you to explore further if you can. Given Better Call Saul flow landscape, moral landscape, I mean, in all the elements you have been mentioning that influence our moral engaging with a narrative, what about the moral landscape? Because I mean, when I was watching that, okay, Lalo, like the scorpion in the fable, is in its nature to do that.
Sure,
So I don't really care. I'm not.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So what about it?
Yeah. Remind us, what's his worst action?
Killing Patrick Fabian, shooting.
Oh, yeah.
It was just 1 minute after. Yeah.
1 minute after.
I didn't want to say.
Sure. Yeah.
That's why. Your fault.
Yeah, my fault.
So you know what I mean? What about the
Sure. No. It's a good question. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, really Lalo is a villain, and that might seem a trivial point to make, but there's a huge difference between a villain and an anti-hero, right? So I say he's almost a villain because a villain, I think, is defined by a complete lack of a moral compass, a complete lack of moral capacity. Now that's not quite true of Lalo, because as is often the case with gangster figures, the kind of the footnote that's offered to his villainy is that he's good to his own people, right? So there's that passage of season 6 where we see him in his own compound in Mexico, and he's great. It's essentially he's a great family man, right, to the people who work for him and his immediate relatives. But that is really just a footnote. I mean, in other words, I agree with you broadly in terms of the way he's presented. Now, so the way you put it in the question is, there's a sense in which Lalo is kind of like, he's not the real focus of our emotional responses, including responses of distress and anger, right? Rather, it's Jimmy and Kim, and I think you're right. Why is that so? Well, actually, the scene they show kind of takes us to that very point, right? I can't recall how much I allowed you to see, but what Howard is saying to them in his monologue is, you, and especially Kim, you have the capacity to know better. You're a proper moral agent, and you've chosen to suppress your moral principles, your moral instincts, in order to pursue this other thing, right? And it is part of the drama of seasons 5 and 6 that, as I put it, maybe in too summary fashion, she kind of breaks that, right? We kind of see her quite consciously deciding, well, it's an interestingly complex thing, right? On the one hand, she leaves the law firm and does pro bono work, right, for kind of, vulnerable poor people. On the other hand, she kind of gets more and more into Jimmy's kind of malicious, pranking, which leads to the outcomes that we see. So,
following that, can we say that the audience can be also sociopathic with some secondary characters because we don't really care that much about the consequences of their actions?
That sort of was in my mind in putting the quote about sociopathy, is that there is a way in which kind of fictions kind of play with, as it were, allowing us to abandon our moral preconceptions, our frameworks, but then at least certain other fictions like this one, explore the abandoning and then the return to them. But Alberto, we probably better get into some other questions.
Thanks for the talk, Murray. As you know, I agree largely with most of the claims that you make about character engagement.
Is there a lot coming?
but
Couldn't have been
I want to
above.
push back a little bit on non-moral factors, which you say inflect or modify that don't establish or transform, okay? Now, one thing about non-moral factors is they can be deceptive and they can be transformative in the sense that, say, beauty can mask a moral rot that eventually comes out in some character's depiction eventually. But, you know, another factor, expect this, I suppose, is race, where it can mask all kinds of other factors that one doesn't notice because one's immediate, quick and dirty judgment is kind of racially based.
Right.
And again, you can think about Native Americans in Westerns, you know, I mean, we have this overwhelming reaction to them, at least in the traditional classic Hollywood
Right.
Western, where they are the bad guys, right? And that can be, I mean, I would argue in some way, that is how they depict it, because
Sure.
you don't get more than that.
Right.
But there's also certain films that transform those kinds of traits into something else. And so the non-moral factors, I think, they can be deceptive, they can be transformed. And I don't know where that falls in your taxonomy of inflect or modify versus establish or transform. But it pushes against a little bit that idea that morality is central to our evaluations. It doesn't displace it, but it makes it a slightly weaker claim.
No, I'm sympathetic to what you're saying, and I think that that's definitely a kind of set of cases that I have to make sense of, either by changing the account or showing how the account can make sense of them. I mean, and I'm not sure I can kind of give a very satisfactory response to it as I stand here, but so I'll just try this though as a starting point. So if we think about, say, the depiction of Native Americans in classic Westerns, I mean, with some exceptions, but we're not talking about the exceptions, we're talking about the run-of-the-mill, demeaning depiction, right? There's a way in which, I think you would agree with this, right? They're not really being presented as fully human.
Right.
And because they're not really being presented as fully human, they're not really moral agents.
Well, they
I'm saying that's meant to be obviously the criticism of the depiction.
I mean, I think they're presented as immoral agents in many ways.
Okay.
But, I mean, there's something about these non-moral factors that I think is a little bit more powerful than your characterization offers
Yeah,
the
Sure.
possibility of.
sure, right. So it would go something like conceptions of what counts as beautiful are kind of tied in with ethnic and racial assumptions.
Well, it's
Right. And those can be so powerful that they can function not just as an inflection, as I put it, of a response of sympathy, but as more foundational.
they can mislead.
Yes, sure.
Can I piggyback on that?
Of course, yeah.
Oh, we probably just have time for this last question.
Oh, okay.
So I know, Ron, I
Go
know.
ahead.
I actually saw your hand up first.
I would like to, I'm not first.
No, I did see your hand up first, yeah. So sorry, I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
We're gonna be here tomorrow, so I'm gonna begin by apologizing for my ignorance. But since I'm gonna listen to people, who come from backgrounds that I'm not familiar with, it would really be helpful if I understood the terms they were using. And don't think I'm alone here when I say I haven't got a clue about what you're talking about with moral understanding. There could be so many different things in my mind. If I want to understand what people are saying tomorrow, I'd really love to hear a little bit more about what it is today.
Sure, okay, well, let me first just say, it was a mistake on my part to kind of drop that in a race.
No, it's my fault.
No, it's not at all. I mean, I really raced over that. That's like very, very, very quickly. So it's a perfect fair question. What can I say very quickly to kind of put a little flesh on that concept? I mean, okay, so here is one distinction that is made in the philosophical literature on, let's say, morality broadly. One distinction that is made is between moral knowledge and moral understanding. So in general in philosophy, at the moment, there's a very sustained debate about, is there a difference between merely knowing something and properly understanding it? So moral understanding often suggests that one doesn't merely have knowledge of, say, some moral principle, say, murder is wrong, right? But one has an understanding of why that principle holds.
So it goes beyond, but I understand that.
Yeah.
But for example, it could be what's moral or immoral, or how we make moral judgments, which are very, very different issues. And if I'm talking about moral understanding, I could be talking about understandings about what is moral and what is not moral, what leads to moral judgments, what doesn't lead to moral judgments. It may be all those things, it might be none of those things. So I'm really trying to, and since a lot of this grant seems to be focused on that, it'd be really helpful for me to understand which aspects of that you're referring to.
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, but it's a complex question with many components.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm trying to get at. What are some of those components?
Well, I just introduced one.
One, yeah.
Right, exactly. And I'm sure we're going to hear many more in the course of the course. Yeah.
If you come to our poster, you'll be able to see it tomorrow. Just telling you, it's defined right on our poster. Is it not? It's right there. You recall that, right, Dan? You saw it. You don't have, we tried. Yeah, we're not blind. I promise. No, I think it's a really good question. And I'm so excited that we have so much interest in this topic. And Murray, thank you so much for really,
Was it?
well, yeah, I think it was, it provoked some thinking on my part at least, and I hope I speak for other people in the audience. So I really appreciate you kicking us off in such a stellar session. Yeah, it's really welcome. And thank all of you for your patience and listening. At this point, we can sort of meander over to this reception if people like, or if people haven't checked into the hotel and want to go check into the hotel on their way. Officially, the kickoff is